Blog Talk Radio.
This is BR on the World for the 13th day of August 2013. The program should air about 8:30 to 9 Greenwich Mean Time today. So it's about, 4:30 in the eastern part of the U.S. in New York. So we are airing this particular episode as Bostonred here. We'll start with the Israeli release of prisoners, political prisoners, and it is just a drop in the bucket. They're releasing some Palestinians, a group of 26 convicted of attacks that happened before 1993. So in other words, they've been in jail for a very, very long time. These people are seen by many in the world, and of course obviously by the Palestinians, as freedom fighters. It is part of an ongoing negotiation between the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the Americans. The Secretary of State, John Kerry, is in the middle of this. And this is a dynamic that has been going on for a very long time. The Palestinians want to establish their state in Gaza and, of course, in the West Bank. In the way of this is roughly 500,000 Israelis that are settled there illegally according to international law. Now, this is a major sticking point. Of course, some accommodation, unfortunately, will be given, and new settlements are being added virtually daily. In fact, they have approved, this is the Israeli authorities, 1,000 homes. And this is the old idea: if you have land and you occupy the land, it is your quote-unquote land. Well, squatters can always move in, and that's basically what you have here. They're in 100 settlements. This is according to the BBC. Now, these have been built over a long period of time, since the 1967 occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Now, remember, Jerusalem at one time was not a divided city. It is now a divided city, and the West Bank is occupied. And you'll hear it in the last part of our broadcast, a roundup from the station Al Jazeera, who does a very good job of covering some things in this area and some things not. When it comes to Egypt, it is not as objective nor as in-depth as it should be. But in this instance, it's pretty much on the money. The BBC, incidentally, has been known since colonial days to be the network before Al Jazeera came along, and BBC is somewhat limited now in terms of funding and its outlook under the present Tory government in the UK. But it has always had an Arab service for information and quote-unquote propaganda tools, language service, and it's always specialized in coverage of the Mideast. It's had correspondents there, and that is part of their bailiwick. Whereas here in North America, we really don't have that type of emphasis by the major news organizations here. Now, the Reuters service out of London is an exception to that. They do cover the Mideast, and of course today with social media, as you'll hear in the toy drone report, that the Mohammed Morsi supporters are using little toy drones type planes, model planes they're called in the U.S. here, and attaching cameras to them, and they're basically flying them over their demonstrations. And that video is saved and put on YouTube, so they can get out how many demonstrators they have out there. And you'll hear in the Al Jazeera report they're talking about this to get the types of information out that they can get out. Now, the negotiations between the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the Americans and other parties will be broadcast somewhat in the U.S., but it will be sort of what we call a tertiary type situation, because bear in mind that people in the U.S. Have a little knowledge, but not really very much. It is, as one would say, severely tinted or handicapped by Zionist lobbies within the U.S. as to what the U.S. policy has been since the Israelis settled in Palestine. It's back to the 40s. So in other words, U.S. policy by virtue of both political parties, at one time the Democratic Party much more so than the Republican Party, but now the Republican Party, and specifically through its evangelical wing. I was thinking about a situation where I was talking to some evangelical several years ago that it actually went to Israel and worked in a kibbutz as part of her quote-unquote religious mission, understanding that these right-of-the-center evangelicals at that time saw it as a promised land, as the people that are now occupying Palestine claim also. So anyone can literally have a quote-unquote promised land, and that is part of a big propaganda tool, and it's very difficult to counter that in the U.S. because what you have is the monopoly media, the ABC, NBC, CBS's, the Fox cable and various cable outlets are all pushing the same line. That is the pro-Israeli line, and that is also through the major political parties in the U.S. Been pushing that. We've had a few respites from that during the Carter administration somewhat, and during the Reagan administration a little bit more quote-unquote even-handed policy through James Baker. But all of that has basically been out of the American political world, or as we call the body politic, since Reagan left office. The Bush administration, this is the first President Bush, was a little bit more accommodative to Israel, and of course subsequent administrations under G.W. Bush, the son, were much more accommodative, and the right wing of the Republican Party, if you want to call it that, the ultra-right wing, the Tea Parties, etc., they are more attached to the Israeli state. So what you see here is, basically you have to look at it as this. In Israel you have a right-of-center government, Likud, under Bibi Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's the most extreme elements there. And the same extreme elements are here in the Republican Party, but at the same time you also have, as far as the Israeli policy, the Democratic Party in the Senate, major figures including President Obama, are singing the same tune. Now, President Obama has been characterized as more even-handed. We'll see if this has happened, if he's able to pull something off, in other words, come out with some type of tacit agreement. If he does, it'll be the first agreement since Oslo under Jimmy Carter that there has been any kind of progress made on this, and the reason that it has not been made is sheer politics and the Zionist lobby, and the lack of will on the part of the Democratic Party, which is a centrist party in the U.S. It would be compared to, not exactly, to the Lib Dems in the UK. They are sort of centralist social democrats types, whereas Labour is more to the left of the center, not very much. And of course under Brown and before Brown under Tony Blair, it was had moved more to the middle and became a centrist party. And of course after Blair and Brown moved Labour back more to the left, and of course the Liberal Dems in a coalition with the Tory government were able literally to bring the quote-unquote unholy alliance together. So the minister there, Haig, has been supportive, not as much as in America, of the Libyan, in fact, of the Libyan invasion. And if you look at what is happening in Syria now, you'll see these appendages there and where these basic old-line colonial states are, i.e. the UK, France, Spain, Portugal to a lesser extent. They've used their air bases there. Italy, of course, that was a colonial power in Syria. So thus this whole domain here, we start talking about Palestine, Israel, that whole area, Egypt, was the colonial domain of the UK primarily. So thus they have rule there. They set out the Balfour Agreement basically, and of course the Zionists were able to literally bomb the King David Hotel and run the British out of what was Palestine. And that's very important. There were people in Palestine before the Israelis came and had lived there for 1,000 years. Now here you unfortunately get involved in a lot of mythology based upon a quote-unquote religious interpretation. Now, depending on how you look at history, it can be looked at from two different schools. If you look at it from a material standpoint, historical materialism, you will see that this is just farcical. If you look at it from an idealistic point of view, which religion comes in, that is primarily anti-science. Incidentally, there was a study out that found that people that were non-believers on the whole were much more intelligent than quote-unquote believers. But all of this stuff sort of plays into it, and it goes back to Egypt and Muhammad Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood. They were not progressive, they were religious. And that's something to be remembered. They're not secular. Now, the secular actors in Egypt are basically social democrats that are tied in with the U.S. and other colonial powers. So, in other words, if the flag blows one way or the other way, you have Muhammad Morsi, who was nothing more than a yes man for U.S. Policy, but not as much. And this new government that is being formed by these caretakers under al-Sisi, the commander of the Egyptian army, is basically the same thing. And evidently there was a report in many of the provinces, retired generals, and of course these would be generals that were in the military under the now imprisoned general there, and of course his trial goes on, Muhammad Mubarak. So this is kind of the story out of the Mideast. We'll go to other things in the news today. It's mostly coming out of the Mideast. Excuse me. There's a U.S. Let's see, nuclear unit failed a safety test. The Minuteman III is an unarmed version, well shown there, but nonetheless, out in Montana, this particular missile, it's the 341 missile wing at Main Storm Air Force Base in Montana. That is in the west of states of the U.S. Made tactical low-level errors in an exercise there. The exercise concluded Tuesday, was meant to test the unit's ability to operate safely. That's according to the Air Force. These inspections are designed to be tough to pass. On Tuesday, the Air Force revealed the 341 missile wing was rated unsatisfactory after making errors during an inspection from the 5th to the 13th of August, and as a result of the failure, the entire inspection grade was unsatisfactory. And the main storm is responsible for 150 of these Minuteman III missiles. That's about a third of the land-based nuclear forces within the U.S. And they were installed in the 70s. 450 of these missiles that make up the intercontinental ballistic arsenal of the U.S. And separately, earlier this year, at another base in the middle of the U.S. at Minot, North Dakota, 17 officers there were temporarily stripped of their nuclear watch authority after receiving poor grades on the mastery of nuclear operations. So you can see right now these nuclear weapons in the U.S. Are not as safe as they are portrayed to the world. They talk about nuclear type, actually chemical weapons in Syria, but you look actually to the U.S. and the nuclear stockpile that is one of those situations that we look at. And finally here, well, there's a story here. We'll get to John Kerry here and fractalization. We'll just stay basically where we are. This is from the Reuters. Works to prevent settlement to disputes from hamstringing settler disputes. I'm sorry. And this is back to the peace initiative and the settlers. He's in South America now. Leaders there talking about peace spoke. Let me wait and make sure where he is right now. Yeah, that is where he is. But nonetheless, spoke later in the day with Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen. Abu Mazen will greet the prisoners that have been released. But these housing plans, 3,000 of them in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, are causing problems. Now, he was in Brazil, Brasilia, with the Brazilian foreign minister, and he has said, in the view of the Obama administration, these settlements are illegal. But now, as in Egypt, the Obama administration has a lot of leverage here. Some of it is not being able to be applied because of the lobby within the U.S., but the $1.5 billion given to the Egyptians in military aid and another $1 billion or so there, so it's a few billion there, is second only to the Zionist state in terms of aid that they receive from the U.S. So there is leverage there. Thus, we look to see where it is with this right-wing coalition there. So that's where Kerry is, I guess you'd say, stuck. And there's very little progress made thus far, and over many, many years as to where things are going in the U.S. So we will perhaps see some movement, and we look there. In Mali, incidentally, the election has been decided, and that'll be in our wrap-up there. The losers, so to speak, have conceded. So thus, this is on the 13th day of August. Our news in 10 or so minutes. Bostonred, have a good day. We'll talk to you on Thursday, I believe it is, with these timely reports, we hope.
These pro-Morsi activists, it's an exciting new PR tool. Attach a camera, launch it from the roof of a building, and it's now a remote-controlled drone flying above the protests at Rabat Square to film and photograph the numbers of people showing up. The activists who operate the tiny plane don't want to be identified, but say they hope it brings more coverage of their protests.
The idea was June 30th, the military used government resources to tape and take pictures of the June 30th Tahrir and Ittihadiyya protests, and didn't cover our protests. So we kept thinking, how could we show our real numbers? How could we have an aerial view that can show both our real size?
It's a numbers game. The protests that removed the president drew upwards of 1 million people in Cairo. Since then, Muslim Brotherhood activists have focused on getting their protest numbers up. When you look at the anti-Morsi protests that ushered in the coup, an incredible amount of people. What if you film here and there simply aren't as many people as that?
We've been filmed, and we've had way more people than what's it called, the floods of people coming in. In Eid, there was people from all the way from Abbas al-Aqad all the way to the Sadat Memorial. So no, the numbers game on the street has never really worried us as an anti-coup movement. It has never really worried us. So.
The small drone is banned as a propaganda tool, but activists brought in some from outside Egypt. Things are unlikely to get better in Rabaa Square, however, with the security forces threatening to move in to move the protesters on. Meanwhile, the battle for Egypt's eyes and ears has taken flight. Jane Ferguson.
To the economy, and actually that's immigrants that take less in benefits than British citizens. It's actually that us, immigrants, we don't take out everything we are entitled to, and we also need to acknowledge that immigrants do not have the same rights as British citizens. We are only entitled to state help when we have contributed appropriately. What is really concerning me at the moment, and that's why I speak out about it, is the new policies that the government is planning to implement, and mainly 3 new policies. That is social housing, which will mean that soon...
Ella, can I interject here?
Sorry,
where I have to look after people who
Okay, Liam, hold on 1 second, because when you both speak, I can't hear you. Ella, there are a couple of things that I asked Malika to keep me not from being inside cricket, and certain things that you're about to bring up, you only understand if you live in the UK. So just wind up that thought, because I know that Liam is really eager to actually push back. So just wind up the thought, but don't take us through all of the deep depth of the immigrant process.
To wind up, what is happening at the moment in the UK with all the policy, the changes in policy, it is called immigrant apartheid. That means separating immigrants socially from the rest of the society, separating them from basic state help and from access to basic welfare.
Okay, so Liam, you heard that immigrant apartheid.
In London, you're watching Al Jazeera. Let's run you through our top stories. Israel has released 26 long-time Palestinian prisoners. The majority had been inside for more than 20 years and were convicted of murder by Israeli courts. A total of 104 Palestinian prisoners could eventually be set free, depending on the progress of peace talks, which will resume in Jerusalem on Wednesday. One busload of prisoners is headed to Gaza, the other to Ramallah. Al Jazeera's Sue Turton has more on the progress for those heading to Ramallah.
They will be first taken to Offa prison, which is right on the security checkpoint area, to be double-checked. Their names to be signed off, first of all, before they're brought across. We are hearing that the buses that are bringing them out of Israel have had their windows sealed. So, as has happened before, prisoners can't put their hands out of the windows and kind of do a victory sign, if you like. So, really, the Israeli military trying to manage, really, how this is seen around the world, because everybody is watching to see when the prisoners come out and what happens when they do. Now, I'm in the Makata compound, and slowly families, friends, relatives and officials are turning up here. We're expecting to see the prisoners in a couple of hours' time. You can see some of the mothers, the sisters, all waiting. We've just been having a chat with little Wada in the middle there. She hasn't seen her uncle apart from one time, and he's been in prison for 21 years. So pretty high emotion is going to be running here when these prisoners do turn up, and the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is expected to come out, greet them, welcome them with a kind of official reception, and of course the families, desperate to see them, will then be taking them home for the first time for many in over 20 years.
Israel says it's intercepted a rocket near Egypt's disputed Sinai Peninsula in the early hours of Tuesday. It used its Iron Dome missile interceptor to explode the rocket above the southern Israeli city of Eilat. The security situation in the area has deteriorated since President Morsi was removed from power. Armed groups have become increasingly prominent, launching attacks against Egyptian and Israeli forces. Well, Egypt's interim president is continuing with appointments to consolidate the transition of power 6 weeks after the ousting of Mohamed Morsi. 25 new provincial governors were sworn in. Many were retired generals, replacing members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Violent clashes erupted between police and protesters loyal to Morsi outside government buildings in Cairo. At least 10 people were said to be injured, 12 Morsi supporters arrested. They are refusing to end their demonstration, saying they'll keep protesting until Morsi is reinstated. Mali's opposition candidate has conceded defeat to Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta in national elections held at the weekend. Mali's first election since 2007 was seen as crucial for unblocking billions of dollars in aid after a military coup and rebellion in the north of the country last year. The new president says he hopes Mali will become more united following his victory. 9 police officers accused of murdering a taxi driver in South Africa by dragging him behind a car have been granted bail, a warning that some viewers may find this footage disturbing. Video taken by an onlooker shows the taxi driver being shackled to the car and dragged to a nearby police station. He was later found dead in a police cell. The police officers have pleaded not guilty to murder. 6 Romanians accused of carrying out a huge art heist in the Netherlands say they'll give the paintings back if they can strike a deal. The trial in Bucharest has been adjourned for a month. The stolen paintings, which include works by Picasso, Matisse and Monet, were taken from a Rotterdam gallery last October. They're thought to be worth tens of millions of dollars. It was the biggest art heist in the Netherlands in more than a decade. And another British warship has left for Gibraltar amid growing tensions with Spain over the contested territory. The frigate is one of 10 British Navy vessels that will dock in the British outpost at the tip of Spain. The UK says the deployment is a planned routine exercise. The row reignited after Spain enforced tighter border controls into Gibraltar. And of course, you can keep up to speed with everything that we're covering by going to our website.